We begin our study of fallacious reasoning or informal fallacies with an overview. You already have a solid grasp on two systems of deductive reasoning. You know when deductive reasoning succeeds and when it fails. You also have a solid grasp of inductive reasoning, or more broadly, experiential reasoning. You also have a solid grasp of when arguments that are classified as inductive succeed or fail. Now, the question before us is, when an argument fails, how badly does it fail? And if it fails badly, in other words, if it is a really erroneous argument, what is it that makes it so bad? And that's the question that we're answering here. Now, before we move into a brief overview, let me remind you that when a deductive argument fails, we know that it is invalid. But because a deductive argument is either valid or invalid, there is no sort of intensity of failure, if you will, or there is no spectrum of failure. Instead, if we want to talk about a deductive argument being really bad beyond simply being invalid, we'd then move into talking about content, which takes us outside the domain of deductive reasoning. So, informal fallacies. Now, we've studied formal fallacies. We know that there is a hit parade of argument failures in the deductive realm that are failures of structure. They are invalid, yes, like any other invalid argument, but they're so common that they get their own names. When we're looking at informal fallacies, we're talking about fallacies in the domain of experiential reasoning. Now, there are times when a specific subclass of fallacies do appear in deductive reasoning, and we'll talk about that. But for the most part, when we're talking about informal fallacies, we're talking about egregious experiential reasoning. Let's begin with a definition of a fallacy. A fallacy is an error in reasoning. That is, it's not a factual error, it's a reasoning error. We already know, as I mentioned just a moment ago, that there are deductive fallacies. In other words, these are called formal fallacies. Those are invalid arguments that are so common they get their own name. What we're focusing on here is informal errors in reasoning, and these are typically categorized according to common patterns of error rather than any logical structural error. Where the reason why generally fallacious arguments get their heft, if you will, is that while they're not logically compelling, they are very often psychologically or emotionally compelling. They're also very often deceptive. In other words, there are some linguistic, for example, sleights of hand. There are often hidden assumptions that, when revealed, show the argument is no good. But the hidden assumption is another sort of deceptive tactic, or sometimes just a matter of ignorance on the part of the arguer. But it's when it's a deceptive tactic, it's a sort of sleight of hand. So here is a lovely Calvin and Hobbes argument. Let's cartoon rather, and the argument is an example of erroneous reasoning. The teacher Calvin asks the teacher if he can be excused, and Calvin says, "I have to go bad," so the teacher lets him go. And then Calvin arrives home. His mother says, "What are you doing home?" And Calvin says, "I had to go." Now, you and I know that in the context of the classroom, typically when we say, "I have to go," it means I have to use the bathroom. By the time Calvin gets home, we recognize that "I have to go" has to do with "I have to leave, I have to get out of here," right? Not because I have to go to the bathroom. So here we have a linguistic error, that is where Calvin takes for granted that the teacher is going to believe that the phrase "I have to go" has to do with going to the bathroom, whereas "I have to go" for Calvin means I just want to leave. I don't want to be in class, right? So the teachers agreeing to let Calvin leave is based on the belief that the phrase or the sentence "I have to go" means one thing, Calvin means another. He doesn't alert her to this, his actual meaning, and so he's able to leave. One thing that we should note before moving on is the following. Depending on what sort of textbook you pick up, you're going to get classifications of fallacies that are different from other textbooks. And there are good reasons why the author classifies fallacies one way as opposed to another. But you should know that classifying fallacies is not uniform across textbooks. It's not uniform across presentations in any fashion of poor reasoning. What classifications do give us is a way of organizing our thinking, right? So for that reason, we can follow a broad classification scheme, and then as we drill down, we can see how it is that certain fallacies are classified the way they are, but we also recognize that we might classify them differently than we do. So, for example, every fallacy is problematic because the premise to conclusion relationship is not strong. In other words, the weaker the argument, the less relevant, in some sense of that word, the conclusion is to its premise or premises. So take a moment to pause the video and just read through the ways in which a conclusion is not relevant to its premises, so that you can sort of file this away and bring it back when you're actually studying fallacies in detail. Remember, I mentioned that the weakness of an argument has a range, right? So you can say that an argument is weak on a measurement of, let's say, percentage, right? So anything straddling the 50% line, right, 50% or lower, is going to be a weak argument. But the argument whose conclusion is 50% likely to be true is still better than the argument whose conclusion is 5% likely to be true, if that's the measurement that you're using. Another way to think about the measurement is the intensity of your conviction or your belief in the conclusion. What we want to hone in on is, like I mentioned earlier, those inferences that are obviously weak, but maybe we don't know why, right? So if we have some strategies for analyzing and evaluating the argument beyond the basic classification of weak inference, I think we'll be in pretty good shape in terms of not being fooled by the relevant arguments. And by relevant arguments, I mean those arguments that are fallacious. So what we want to hammer away at repeatedly is identifying what the argument elements are, describing the way that the reasoning fails, and also explaining not just, not just describing the way it fails, but explaining how and why reasoning this way is problematic. So here are some examples of weak experiential reasoning. I think you'll be able to see what these have in common in terms of what makes them bad or extremely weak. First, though, before you pause the video and read the examples, make sure that you can identify the conclusion, identify the premises, and then see if you can articulate to yourself the gap between the premises and the conclusion, right? So, what is it? What's the mechanism whereby the conclusion is supposed to be derived from the premises? And you'll find that, in fact, the mechanism really doesn't have anything to do with the premises. It has to do with some sort of state of mind of the reasoner, right? Or the reader, the person who is looking at or hearing the argument. We also can talk about, as I mentioned before, problematic assumptions. Lots of times, assumptions are made but not asserted. And even when they are asserted, it may not always be obvious that those assumptions are not great ones, right? So remember that an argument gains its power by the way in which the conclusion follows from the premise or premises. So if the premise or premises, which is another, the word premise is another way of talking about an assumption, right? If the premise is problematic, that is going to make the inference problematic in most cases. Here are some rephrase. Here is an example, and then here's an articulation. So remember I said earlier that we should focus on being able to organize the reasoning so that we can describe and explain the failure. So the bold bullet point gives us the reasoning, and then the indented bullet point gives us the description and explanation. In the past 10 years, the minimum wage has not kept up with inflation. The number of people who work minimum wage jobs has also increased during the past 10 years. Therefore, the minimum wage should be increased. Now, you and I may agree that the minimum wage has not kept up with inflation. You and I may agree that the conclusion is true. We may agree that the minimum wage should be increased. You and I may believe that the situation in the U.S. economy is problematic insofar as it seems as though it's harder and harder to make a livable, or to earn a livable wage without working multiple jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But what we don't want to do is simply say, I agree with the content and I agree with the conclusion specifically, and then move on. What we want to do is to see what it is that is happening in this reasoning so that we're not taken in by what turns out to be a problem. So the first premise is relevant to the conclusion, but the second is not, right? It is relevant, the second premise is relevant to the topic, but not the conclusion. So think about it this way. We would not think that a decrease in the unemployment rolls should mean a decrease in the minimum wage. So it seems reasonable to say that we also shouldn't think that the number of people who work minimum wage jobs increasing is relevant to whether or not the minimum wage should be increased. Right? So just taking time to not take for granted that, for example, we may agree with the conclusion and so move on, but taking time to see what the argument is doing is going to make us not only better thinkers in terms of how we process information, but also make us more careful with how we reason ourselves. Here's some more examples. Go ahead and take some time to read through them. So pause the video when you, in a moment. Take some time to read through the examples as well as the discussion of the examples so that you can see what it is that I'm talking about when I'm talking about the analysis that you're going to want to conduct when you are confronted with reasoning that is provided to you as an example of poor reasoning, and how you're going to describe and explain that poor reasoning. Here's another set of examples. Let's do the same thing as we've done before. Read the example, read the discussion, and then move on. And this cartoon funny as it is an example of bad reasoning. The kid is basically being threatened by the father. No child wants to lose a parent's love, and so the kid may be motivated to win, not because the kid wants to win for what we might consider the right reasons, right? So, what are the right reasons to want to win? Well, you want to be seen to excel, or you want to demonstrate your prowess, whatever it might be. But fear of losing the love of somebody who is supposed to protect you and care for you and all of that is not the best reason to want to win. In fact, we're going to see that emotional motivations are in the realm of logic and argumentation in general are not good motivations for believing a claim. And next we have some examples of, more examples, I should say, of emotive reasoning and reasoning that is a distortion, typically a distortion of another person's view. So here, what I'd like you to do is to read through each example and then offer up your own description of what you think is going on and an explanation of how and why what's going on is problematic. When you're ready, go ahead and move on, resume play on the video. Now, I'm only briefly using the Far Side cartoons because there is I think I'm okay with fair use, but there is a pretty strict policy. But Gary Larson is, in my view, who is the author of the Far Side cartoons, is, in my view, required reading, just as is, let's say, Shakespeare and Douglas Adams. Very, very funny, and he also provides some great examples of bad reasoning. See if you can detect what's going on here. And that brings us to the end of this introduction and overview to and of fallacious reasoning.